As I talk to people in the classrooms at Ozark Christian College and in the chairs and in the hallways of the church that I am a part of, I have discovered over the last several years that a lot of us have a struggle. That our image of God often gets muddled with another image. Kind of this syncretic approach that we view God along with another image. I don't know if it's because of during a certain season of the year, we're supposed to be thinking of God and thinking of this person at the same time, that season being Christmas. But I think often we kind of mistake God for being a massive cosmic Santa Claus. Now, this might sound weird to you, might sound kind of funny. Why is Matthew talking about Santa Claus right now in this book of Lamentations? Why is Christmas being brought up here? But I think this really matters when it comes to our relationship with God. We think of God as someone who has a naughty list, where he has a list of people who are doing bad, and that he has a good list, a nice list. And depending on what side we are on, that's how God is going to relate to us. It shows up when it comes to our prayer life, and it shows up when it comes to our thoughts on God's grace. When it comes to our prayer life, if we ask for God to show up and do something for us, or for someone to bring healing to someone's body, and the answer is no, our immediate thought is, it must be because I'm on the bad list. I'm on God's bad side. I'm on the naughty list. But if God answers that person's prayer over there, well, it's because they're on the good list. Now, please don't, I'm not trying to get it twisted. There are some times where maybe we are doing things that we should not be doing. I mean, 1 Peter straight up says to the husbands, take care of your wives so that your prayers do not go hindered. So I want to recognize that. But to automatically assume that God doesn't answer prayers, or his answer is no to prayers because he puts you on a naughty list, it's just you're mistaking God and the complexities of relationship. We're just viewing him as Santa Claus. To think that someone gets an answered prayer simply because they're perfect, right, doesn't seem to make sense. But it happens even when it comes to our ideas of God's grace. We think God has a limit to his grace. I've messed up. And if I mess up a certain amount of times, I run out of chances and I go from the God's good side to God's bad side. I go from nice to naughty. And this creates a really just harmful relationship between us and this cosmic Santa Claus who God is ultimately not. We end up wondering and asking a question: does God's grace run out for his people? And although Christmas was not a thing some 2,500 years ago, whenever Lamentations was first spoken and written, although Santa Claus was not a thought at that time, it nevertheless was a question that they were asking in Jerusalem after they had been besieged by Babylon. We have been looking at the book of Lamentations, and we are now getting to the end. Lamentations chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, it would be good to go ahead and open up to that, as we're going to be looking at a particular verse near the end. Lamentations chapter 5 is the shortest chapter of this book. If you remember from session 1, I told you that each chapter is set up as an acrostic. So chapters 1 through 4 are normally 22 verses, besides chapter 3, which is going to be 66 verses, so it's a multiple of 3 of the 22. But it follows the Hebrew alphabet, going from our equivalent of A to Z. But when you get to chapter 5, the acrostic doesn't happen. It's 22 verses, so still the same amount of numbers or letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but you don't see the acrostic format anymore happening in chapter 5. And though it's different in this way, chapter 5 seems to repeat a lot of the things Lamentations has said before it. It seems just to be uttering the same things, the same themes, going over it one more time. And so it's a short chapter, but it feels like we've been here before as we went through chapters 1 through 4. For example, we see things like reversal. We see the world being upside down again in chapter 5. We see hunger and thirst of the people. We see the siege of the city. We see the exile of the people. We see the acknowledgement of the people's sins. And as we get to the very end of Lamentations chapter 5, we see a question that was asked at the very beginning being asked once again. And so Lamentations chapter 5, starting in verse 19, going to verse 22, says this: "But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." The question that was asked at the beginning and that is being asked here at the very end of this book of lament is, God, do you care? God, do you care? I wonder if Lamentations chapter 5 repeats itself of all the different themes going before it, because at no point does God ever offer an answer. There are questions asked in the book of Lamentations. There's that brief moment in chapter 3 of hope. But at no point does God ever give an answer of either yes or no. And so Israel is left with saying in chapter 5, it begins by saying, remember us, consider us, look at us, pay attention to us. But the poet is wondering, is this our last interaction with our God? Is the siege of Jerusalem and the exile of the Israelites into Babylon the last thing that they will remember when it comes to Yahweh? Is God's grace finally run out? And although it's more than 2,500 years removed from our time, we still have people, there are still seasons in our lives where we wonder that same question. We look around at our world and we wonder, is God just finally fed up? Is the world too messed up? We wonder, have I messed up so many times that I'm now on the naughty list and God's grace has ran out? I have sinned 7 times. He's forgiven me 7 times. He's forgiven me 49 times. He's forgiven me 500 times. But I wonder if God's grace is finally out. Jeremiah ends his text on a cliffhanger. It's almost as if you could put a ... at the end of Lamentations. Many commentators believe that's actually how we should take it. The text seems to say this: return us to yourself, O Lord, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, ... And the text provides no answer to this question. Maybe God is actually done with his people. But although the text doesn't provide an answer, history does. We know, and this is probably the reason why the book of Lamentations is actually part of our Old Testament canon, that God is faithful to his people, that he does bring them out of Babylon 70 years later and brings them back into Jerusalem. But something even more important happens some 500 years later. that God comes into the world through his son Jesus and ultimately ends our exile, being in captivity to sin and envy and pride, and we are restored to God. God's answer to does God care is an emphatic yes. And although Lamentations doesn't provide the answer, the cliffhanger begs us to look for what the answer will be. And the answer is the incarnation of his son. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him would have eternal life. God gives himself. Jesus is God from God, light from light. And he comes into the world and he touches sorrow. And anything God comes into genuine contact with cannot help but be transformed. I'll say that again. Anything that God comes in contact with genuinely cannot help but be transformed. When God comes in contact with the burning bush is not destroyed. As a matter of fact, the ground becomes holy ground. Whenever Isaiah comes in contact with the holy God, he says, I come from a people of unclean lips. And yet when he comes in contact with God, his mouth is transformed into being a holy mouthpiece for the Lord. Whenever Jesus comes in contact with the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, she is healed from her pain and she is called a daughter of God. And when Jesus comes in contact with the thing that causes the most despair, the thing that causes the most wreckage in our lives, death itself, it cannot help but being transformed. Death used to be the end. It was a wall. It was the grave. It was a sea of darkness. But when Jesus touches it, when he becomes united with death in his death, he is not transformed. It is left transformed. It goes from being a wall to being a door that just gets us even closer to the face of God. And so the answer to the question, does God care, is yes. And he cares so much that he's not going to go over the sorrow, but he's going to come into the sorrow with us and rescue us from it. So what is the solution to this answer? God's solution to desolation is redemptive unification. God's solution to desolation, to sorrow, to despair is redemptive unification. God doesn't go over sorrow or below the sorrow. He goes through the sorrow. God goes into the disorienting experience that the people within the siege of sin and death are experiencing, and says, I am with you. God goes through the layers of the historical, of the spiritual, and of the emotional needs, and says, I will transform you within it. And as we walk with God through the sorrow, as we go through life and we live life with people in despair, we end up becoming more like Jesus, people who can also go through sorrow, not viewing God as dishing out just bad things because people are on his bad side and good things because people are on his good side, but recognizing that God is with every single person who seeks him. We end up becoming more like Jesus. I want us to allow Lamentations to look more like Jesus. A people, a church, a community that doesn't go away and is not shuttered by sorrow, but actually goes into it and embraces the ugliness, knowing that there can be beauty found within it. I want us to be like the one who traded his robes of the Ancient of Days and put on the rags of a slave. I want us to be like the one who took off the crown of majesty and put on a crown of thorns. I want us to be like the one who went on the cross and died so that we can be freed from captivity to envy and to pride. I want us to be like the one who breathed a final breath so that we could truly have life after death. Let us allow Lamentations to shape us to be more like Jesus. And so as we go through life, we do not avoid the sorrow. We go through it and we know that it is that the answer to the problem of desolation is redemptive unification. Let us, therefore, let lament have its day, for we know that love will have the last say.